Welcome to Korean Cinema Today, the official podcast of the Korean Film Council. We have a great show for you today. In fact, it's going to be the first part of a 2-episode series on the new kind of the burgeoning relationship between the Chinese and Korean film industry. I'm one of your co-hosts. My name is Pierce Conran. I write for koreanfilm.or.kr. That is KoBiz, the Korean Film Council's English language news source. And joining me today, of course, is my co-host June. Hi, June. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I missed you guys last time, but I'm here back and really excited to talk with Brian about Chinese cinema and the Korean film industry all together.
Very glad to have you with us again today. And why don't we talk a little bit about KoBiz, first of all. You can get anything on Korean film can be found on this website. We have news, features, and interviews, a webzine, and a newsletter. All of those can be found at koreanfilm.or.kr.
Always keep up with us on our SNS, social media, on our Facebook at kobiz.kofic, KoBiz.kofic, or on our Twitter /Korean Film Biz, KOREAN Film Biz, BIZ.
All right, today we have us Dr. Brian Yecies. It's our very great pleasure to have him with us today. He is part of the Cultural Studies program at the University of Wollongong and also the co-author, along with Aegyeon Shim, of the book Korea's Occupied Cinemas, 1893 to 1948. So Brian, welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you again.
Oh, thank you very much. Great to be here.
All right. Just a bit earlier this year, I was very lucky to meet Brian at a special conference at the Korea's Advanced Institute of Science and Technology on new media in Korean cinema. Okay, so June, you want to kick us off today?
Sure, let's just start off with some basic questions. What made you become involved in Asian cinema and especially in the Korean and Chinese industries?
In the mid-90s, when I was teaching at the University of Arizona while I was doing my master's degree, I had a bunch of Korean students. And one night, a bunch of us watched Kim Dong-won's 1988 documentary called Sangye-dong, Olympic. And after that film, or even during the film, I found myself crying because some of the scenes and content was so emotional. And I look over, and all the Korean students are all weeping as well. So that was my pretty quick introduction to Korean culture and also the kind of emotion that a filmmaker such as Kim Dong-won could capture with such a film, that 1988 film. So I think that opened my eyes to Korea. And then when Korean cinema started to take off in the late 90s, I was already in tune for that shift, that change.
On top of those two industries, I saw that you also do a lot of other research, including a range of topics that include sound film, Korean films from the colonial period, and Hollywood. So we were wondering, what other researchers are you working on currently?
Great question. Well, I guess we could go back to how I got started. And what did it for me was the Korean films being screened at the Melbourne International Film Festival when I was living in Melbourne, finishing my PhD at the time in the mid to late 90s. And so I was exposed to Motel Cactus, Park Ki-young's film Number 3, all of Kim Ki-duk's Birdcage Inn, Wild Animals, Real Fiction, The Isle, and also Spring in My Hometown. And I became a huge fan of Kim Ji-yoon. And also, of course, Bong Joon-ho with Barking Dogs Never Bite, right? So these were all contemporary films that started to appear in the Melbourne International Film Festival from 97 to 2000. However, instead of writing about the contemporary Korean cinema, I thought I would pick something a bit more challenging, was going back through the history. And one book in particular drove my interest, and that had to have been Lee Young-il's book, The History of Korean Cinema. It was published in 1998. It was a sort of revised or English version of his late 60s book of the same content. And it was the first English book about Korean film history available, essentially. However, it was lacking sources. It was lacking a kind of rigorous documentary approach to that history. And I thought, I want to be the guy to write that history. And so I went through archives in the U.S., looked at the government archives, and went through archives in Japan and also Korea, and was able to uncover a lot of that history based on evidence, based on newspaper articles, based on statistics that were collected by the colonial government, the U.S. government, and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's true. It's hard to find historical, especially Korean historical information in English, especially. So I'm sure it'll be used by future students in the upcoming years.
It must have been very challenging in those early days. As you say, that was kind of at the beginning of this kind of swell for Korean cinema. And previous to that, I mean, there was little to no research overseas about Korean film. We're here to talk a little bit about the ties between China and Korea these days, because it's made the news a lot, and people are talking a lot about what's been going on last year, and particularly this year. But of course, you've mentioned before that the seeds for today's relationship were planted more closer to 2 decades ago, at a time when Korean students were going to the Beijing Academy, the Beijing Film Academy. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Beijing Film Academy, the kind of state-run premier institute for learning film in China. So around that time, in the very early 90s, maybe late 80s, there were quite a few fifth-generation Chinese films exhibited and imported to Korea. So Koreans got a sense of some of the wonderful fifth-generation films coming out of China at that time. Red Sorghum, Judo, Raise the Red Lantern, Farewell, My Concubine, Chen Kage's Yellow Earth. So these were all films that started to raise awareness among Koreans in Korea of Chinese national cinema, fifth generation. And so also at that time, there were very few opportunities to study film in Korea. One of the few places was KAFA, the Korean Film Academy, and run by KoFik, as you probably know. So given that interest or that awareness of Chinese national cinema, fifth generation, given the limited opportunities here in Korea, people like Lee Chi-yoon and a lot of others went over to study film at the Beijing Film Academy around 93. And they also picked up a lot of Chinese language skills. They also obviously became really good friends with, well, at the time would have been sixth generation Chinese filmmakers. So their interest in studying in China and the networks that they built today have been critical to what we're seeing today.
Absolutely. I imagine it kind of certainly laid a foundation. I mean, the things that have happened in the last year or two could hardly have come out of nowhere.
And the thing that works in China, as most of us all know, is this kind of idea of personal networks and guanxi. And you absolutely can't develop those overnight. So I firmly believe, and I've seen this happen, in person. These are 2 decades old networks that have been built, and the Korean film industry is enjoying the fruits of those relationships. So after leaving the Beijing Film Academy, producers such as Lee Chi-yoon come back and get jobs in the Korean film industry. One of the first films he worked on was Kang Jae-gyu's The Ginkgo Bed in 96. And then a lot of Koreans stay here. The ones that studied at the BFA and all their mates that also learned skills here, the Korean cinema took off. And flash forward a few years, and the sixth generation Chinese filmmakers that knew and saw Korean cinema taking off started to call up some of their old friends and ask, can you help us to make some of our own blockbusters or Chinese versions of Saving Private Ryan or the Chinese Taeguki?
Right. So I think you showed a clip from that during your talk. So
Feng Xiaogong, as the story goes, 2006, 2007, gets in contact with people like Lee Chi-yoon, and Lee Chi-yoon, through his personal networks in the Korean cinema, is able to bring over the pyrotechniques experts, the action choreographers, and the visual and special effects people and teams that help create Kang Jae-gyu's Taeguki. And so they help Feng Xiaogong and Feng Xiaogong's Chinese film crews make assembly using many of the same techniques that we could see in Taeguki and so forth. So it's a transformation that has taken 2 decades, but it's intensified in the last several years.
So after there's a lot of talk of the kind of the Korean actors and directors that go over to China, but what you're telling me is a lot about these kind of this below the line staff, these visual effects people and colorists, and the kind of the impact that they're having on the Chinese film industry. Is it? How significant is it?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of the films and collaboration that I'm looking at and documenting and trying to conceptualize are films that fall out of the radar or off the radar. They're not official co-productions, but they're absolutely critical for both industries because they're the essence of that collaboration, that collaborative relationship. So according to my count, about a third of Chinese cinema's top grossing films over the last 5 years have had Korean input, as you would call it, below the line. So we're talking about visual effects, special effects, those demolition experts, the pyrotechnics, the action choreographers. So Digital Idea, Digital Studio 2L, SK Independence, and CJ Powercast are just some of the companies, Macrograph, and just some of the Korean companies that are in China and making that relationship work. So working on Sui Hak's 3D film Flying Swords of Dragon Gate in 2011, CZ12, a.k.a. Chinese Zodiac, directed by Jackie Chan in 2012, one of the top performing Chinese films of all time.
Yeah, also featuring a Korean star in Kwon Sang-woo, as an aside.
One of your favorites?
No, but he's very big. He's a favorite of many other people.
It's a long laundry list of films that Koreans have contributed to, and so I look forward to sharing that over time with more of your audiences.
Absolutely, and just to finish on that point, the film Monkey King, one of the year's biggest movies. You mentioned a very surprising figure on that, like how many Korean companies were involved in that production.
If you look at the end credits of the Monkey King from 2014, there's about 28 special effects and visual effects companies that contributed to the making of that film, and 11, by my count, are either based in Korea or have Korean staff. Some of which are now working directly from Beijing. So Forest Studios, Dexter Digital, which has offices in Paju and Beijing. 11 Korean companies. It's quite a remarkable contribution to that single film.
It's incredible, and it's a huge blockbuster we're talking about.
Just moving on from that idea of sharing human resources and technology, do you see any similarities between Korean and Chinese films that are domestically just Korean and Chinese films, but have adopted each other's characteristics in filmmaking?
That's a very exciting area that I think more scholars need to, and critics need to pay attention to. I haven't looked at that in great detail yet, but I do sense that given the creative input that Korean post-production experts such as Ethan Park or Lee Young-gi actually working in Beijing on these major Chinese films, they're bringing new creative ideas to the center of the Chinese film industry. So over time, we can only assume that creativity will seep out. At the moment, though, given what Chinese producers prefer and what Chinese producers think their audiences prefer, the full creative possibilities that Koreans have or have potential to demonstrate are not being fully utilized. For example, the color red is still a very important color for a lot of Chinese historical epics and Chinese films, and that's a color that traditionally Korean filmmakers have kind of not felt the need to focus on or utilize to the same extent that Chinese films utilize. It's a very small example, but anyway, the short answer to your question is that that gap, creativity gap, that cultural gap, is closing, but a bit slower than we might expect.
Right. So if we look at the actual technical and the industry side of things, do you also see similarities in the workings of each industry other than the actual final products?
Again, in my view, and I've only really focused on post-production experts, Korean post-production experts working in China, I do feel and I do see the technical capabilities and the technical prowess of both cinemas, the gap closing, but there is still a gap. And I think there's a different approach that filmmakers in both countries have to the filmmaking process. And the reason why I think that is because I've asked filmmakers from both sides. And the basic story that I get is that Chinese filmmakers are so used to this state-oriented, state-motivated filmmaking context that the core purpose of film is very different than it is in other countries, such as Korea or even the U.S. or even France. Having said that, I've also heard from Chinese filmmakers that Chinese filmmakers work in the industry as a kind of they treat it as a job. They work for the money, not because they're money hungry, but the attitude that they have toward the work is not about and this is generally speaking, it's not about honing a craft in the same way that it is for Korean filmmakers. So in other words, Korean filmmakers work for love of the craft, the challenge and the kind of thirst to better themselves. Whereas at the moment, because of that gap between international standards, whatever you want to call it, that state-led filmmaking context, Chinese filmmakers haven't fully experienced the working for love part yet. That's my opinion based on what I've gleaned from interviewing Chinese filmmakers and Korean filmmakers.
Hopefully that might change over time.
It is changing. That's the gap that I keep referring to, that there's a technical gap that's narrowing thanks in large part to the Korean contributions, both in technical but also story, aesthetics, and so forth, in front of the camera, behind the camera, but also as the Chinese cinema matures and metamorphosizes from that state-led context to a more of a highly commercialized, fully industrialized, systematized industry.
Yeah. These things obviously take time. I mean, the industry, their exhibition industry is growing. It's 35% a year, and it's such an enormous beast now. And there are so many vested interests, and it's hard to kind of do something about rocking the boat, maybe. And I guess, as you say, it takes time for everything to kind of settle down, and hopefully that will it might lead to some different things in the future. But talking of some of these professionals that have lent their hand to developing the crafts in the Chinese film industry, could you mention some of the leading Korean film professionals on the Chinese film scene at the moment?
Well, they are too numerous to mention. That goes without saying. But I have spent a lot of time when I visit Beijing every year to spend time with people like Lee Young-gi and Ethan Park. Lee Young-gi has gone through, originally both of those guys were with HFR. And together they have worked on over 200 of the top and most critically acclaimed Korean films.
These are, correct me if I'm wrong, these are the colorists, right?
They started off doing analog coloring.
Okay.
And now they're digital colorists. So digital intermediary, that post-production process that brings out detail in the film colors in the film and altering colors in the film to a producer's or a director's through their choices.
I think, and a very good example you mentioned of their work is the extremely iridescent M by Im Yong-se in 2007.
Well, I was lucky enough to be in the digital post-production suite when Im Yong-se's M was being digitally enhanced for the Japanese DVD. And the colors were amazing. And that was Ethan Park's sort of working more than sort of maybe 100 hours a week.
My goodness.
But both of those guys, Li Yonggi, so how they're specifically changing things in China is that they start off by going over part-time sort of around '08 when they were both representing HFR, one of the big, post-production firms in Korea, worked on Nom Nom Nom, all of Park Chan-wook's films and Bong Joon-ho's films. So the top guys here wanted a challenge, saw an opportunity, took the risk, went over to China part-time, and then now they're both over there full-time. They've been full-time for several years. But when over time, they've literally brought state-of-the-art equipment to the firms that they not only have worked for, the Chinese-owned firms, but when they start their own firms, which they have. In fact, it's hard to keep up with the new latest name of their firm, although Ethan Park's now just celebrated his 1-year anniversary with Forest Studios in the Chaoyang district of Beijing. So Ethan Park and Li Yonggi, they bring over, I know Ethan Park brought over a 4K projector so that he could see the final print of the film in the same way that audiences would see it in cinemas with 4K projection. So he's one of the first people to bring that over. But having said that, just because a post-production firm has that state-of-the-art equipment doesn't always guarantee that they'll fully utilize the creativity that comes with it. So those are just two of the guys I spent a lot of time with, and they are known for also training other younger people. And in this case, those younger people used to be mostly Koreans, both a combination of Korean Chinese that lived in Beijing or around Beijing in the Wangjing area, right? But also they brought over some people from Korea. And in that way, the techniques and the networks that they had have expanded.
So you mentioned some of their credits, including Park Chan-wook and Bong Joon-ho films, some of the most critically acclaimed Korean films of all time. And just earlier you were talking about, I guess, the Chinese films that are being made right now, the very kind of commercial ones. What exactly is their reason for going over to work in China? Not to be indelicate, but is it a question of money?
Good question. I think they like the technical challenge. Okay, they also like the money, although I have no idea how much they're making or for that matter, how they're getting the currency out of Beijing, although I happen to see a lot of ajumas doing like sort of business deals, or I've heard of ajumas doing business deals, wiring it to their nephews. So that's an issue of getting the money out of China.
Sure. Yeah. A
lot of Koreans working in China are spending well, living well in China. But again, what that means, they don't have a lot of time to spend because they're working long hours. But if I could go back to the real point of your question, a lot of the Korean technicians, such as Lee Young-gi and also Ethan Park, went over for the challenge, as I understand it. Korean cinema, the Korean film industry, has reached a certain peak several years ago in terms of what they could do here. So opportunities dried up at home. There are a lot of differences. You can't categorize it. You can't put both of those guys in the same category. They're very different. But in talking to them, at least in Ethan Park's case, he wants to be known as a Chinese technician who can speak Korean, a good Chinese technician. So his Chinese language skills are excellent.
Okay.
And that's a critical point, which I think we might come back to a little bit later or maybe now.
Sure, no, it's very significant.
Knowing Chinese is really critical as I've come to learn from meeting these people, is it really narrows the cultural gap between the possibilities of what a collaboration can be. If you're reliant on a translator, the deals and the ideas and the brainstorming is only as good as that translator. And there are some good translators.
Of course, but it's very limited. And something we've discussed already with Korean filmmakers going over to Hollywood, for instance. There's this issue of translation is certainly a significant one.
Translators. Now, today I have a new punishment program for poor translators because I'm thinking that The Last Stand with Kim Ji-yoon's project and also Park Chan-wook's project in the U.S. Stoker. I mean, I'm thinking that those two films in particular could have been perhaps much better if there was a better translator.
Well, actually, I'm just going to take a little aside. I happen to know the translator for Park Chan-wook's producer, Ton Won-jo, I think his name is. And he's. I was actually quite a fan of Stoker. I was less keen on The Last Stand. But he was an excellent translator, as far as I could tell, for Director Park. But that's purely subjective.
Scapegoating. and I'm sorry for the translators out there because I know that they've helped me a lot over the years as I've made presentations at various universities, and I've been quite dependent on them personally. So I know the pressure, but it's a point about the limitations of using translators. And in Ethan Park's case, he's able to deal directly with Chinese producers and Chinese directors, and that has helped him immensely.
Of course, it must make a huge difference. And so this obviously, some of these Korean professionals going over to China are learning Mandarin, as they should. It's very useful. But do they have any other challenges as Korean film professionals in the country?
Do you mean apart from the air pollution?
Well, let's talk about that.
That's a serious issue because that possibly prevents or makes Korean film professionals think twice about bringing their families over. Some have brought some of their families with young children over, but then decided that that's not going to work out long term. Other challenges, I know that HFR had a rocky start because of competition, unexpected competition from people that were like close to that organization. So in other words, I think there's a story.
Other Korean firms? Or?
No, a Chinese firm.
Okay.
So this idea of the risks, there are business risks of working so closely with Chinese partners. There's a lot of really good people in China and a lot of really good collaborative partners, but there are other people that won't feel, a lot of Chinese industry people that won't feel a loyalty or a need to protect each other's turf. I'm speaking generally here, but that is a big risk, a risk about upskilling the Chinese industry so well that it will reduce the need to work with Koreans in the future. So in other words, there is a feeling among a lot of Koreans working in China in the industry that there'll be a kind of use-by date, at which point there will be less of a need. Except for people like Ethan Park, and I keep going back to him because he is very unique in that regard. His language ability and his attitude about he wanting to be seen as a Chinese technician who can speak Korean, I think will mitigate that risk. And that's exactly his, I don't think it's a secret, but that I hope will work out for him.
Yeah, it certainly seems it's a very delicate process, kind of a stepping into a foreign film industry, especially one that is as significant and as growing as a Chinese one. So a lot of challenges there.
We could talk more about risks if you have time, because I think if we look at the gaming industry, for example, in Korea, very well known, very well accomplished. In 2012, toward the end of 2012, Shanda Shanda, a Chinese gaming company, for years had licensed a Korean mirror game, a game called Mirror, from Acta's Soft. I mean, and this Chinese firm did so well from licensing Korean content that it was able to buy, within 18 months, was able to buy a majority of control in the Korean company.
It's very interesting.
And so you have a very kind of awkward situation. However, having said that, Acta's Soft did come out well because they were, in return for the Chinese company buying a majority shares in their company control, was able to offer them 30% of all sales in the Chinese market, which was more than they ever made by licensing their number one product to the Chinese game distributor. So there is an upside.
Right. This is the thing between the Chinese and Korean industries. I mean, one country is 30 times the size of the other. It's it's not a drop in the bucket.
And I think that leads us. It's a nice transition to the recent news, sort of just six weeks ago, of NEW being invested in by the Chinese company Huache, and that's about what, 60 million US, roughly 15% of the NEW was optioned or purchased by that Chinese firm.
Yeah, and NEW, of course, is a huge company at this point. Only a few years ago they were set up, but last year they were the leading Korean film distributor in the country. They've dropped down since, but a very huge company, and China getting involved in that. What do you think are the implications of that?
It's too early to tell, but by reading the trade news, depending on how clever and how well connected the Chinese company is, will determine how well the films that they license for the Chinese market, how well they'll do. But also, this opens the door for some wonderful collaborative opportunities, remakes in particular, which I know from reading the trade news is very exciting for NEW. Plus, if you read between the lines, you can see how NEW will be able to expand immediately upwards of, I wouldn't say double the size of their company, but maybe close to it. It's literally almost doubling overnight, thanks to this injection of 60 million US. And even this morning, NEW had their IPO announcement, and I haven't read the news, so I'm not sure how well it did, but this kind of lets us end on a kind of note that possibly is both exciting for the Korean film industry, its opportunities in China, with a Chinese partner holding their hand, but also a little bit of jitters for not fully knowing what it can morph into, or if it will replicate the software case of Shanda and Acta's Soft.
Right. I think there's definitely interesting chemistry when they come together to work. In my opinion, I feel like the Chinese the side is more so dominating in terms of supporting with the finances. Do you think there are recurring roles when they work together on projects?
I think that depends on how many projects they can do together. There's obviously this capacity building benefit. If you work on multiple projects, just like the Korean firms have done internally, you develop these great working relationships and methods, and because there's a lot of awkwardness when two different countries' teams come together. I mean, there's awkwardness with little things like what you eat, where you eat. I'm telling you, I've interviewed people that worked on the Bruce Beresford it was meant to be a co-production, Mao's Last Dancer in 2008. And there were so many little but big cultural awkward things that happened at that production where people ate. There was, for example, the Chinese and the Australian crews ate in separate quarters, and that was a weird thing. But in fairness to the casting director and the translators, they didn't really know what to do, like how to handle that. They knew Australian crews wouldn't be interested in eating the same food as the Chinese crews. So in fairness to the people behind the scenes, they didn't really know. But if you get the opportunity to work together on a second and a third and a fourth project, then you can overcome, you could move beyond those little awkward moments or details because you get to know each other. Mm-hmm. So working together on multiple projects has got to be critical. And that will close the cultural gap, I think.
Good point.
Was that a good answer to your question? It's a huge question. It's an important question.
I also wonder if they have specific roles that they're given to them. Like I was talking about the finances, like do Chinese always back up the budget and the Korean industry provide with the human resources? Or is there some other partnerships happening in a different format with divided roles?
That depends on if it's a formal co-production that's policy-based and policy-driven, or if it's some of the informal projects, some of which I've mentioned today. I have yet to fully investigate that area, but I do know, generally speaking, that the money game or the money side of the business in China is very different than it is in Australia or Korea or even in the U.S. There's a lot more, there seems to be a lot more money floating around in China at the moment. And therefore, and if you mix that with some of the agendas for making films in the first instance, or buying a cinema chain, Wanda's buying of the AMC cinema chain in North America, I'm not convinced that they bought it for, nor are a lot of critics convinced that Wanda did that to make a profit.
No, that doesn't make any sense.
So there's a whole other agenda sort of being played out here, and that carries through with productions as well. Some people are putting money forward to make films just because they can. Other people are so the financing thing is very dynamic and very interesting and very informal in a lot of times. Also, Chinese firms that have money don't want to be tied down by policy. They don't want to have to go through KOFIC to shoot in Seoul. They don't want the red tape. They don't want to have to wait. I don't know how fast the Seoul tax incentive or the location incentives, I don't know how long that takes to get, but the Chinese producers I've talked with just they've got the cash. They just want to come in and shoot, make a film, and not have to get caught up in all that paperwork.
Right, there is a lot of paperwork, although the process of the incentive is that they apply for the incentive, and once they get approved, they just go ahead and shoot and pay their bills, whatever else, and they just report it to KOFIC to get the refund, pretty much. So that's the deal.
A rebate system, as it were.
So you don't have to wait to shoot, but there are still paperwork involved.
But I can see your point, absolutely. China is just money right now. There's just so much money.
Right.
And money means power, and power means influence. And when you have to go jump through hoops, some people aren't very happy about that. And I think with that, we'll have to close this first part of this illuminating discussion, but we'll be back with our next episode talking again about so much to talk about with China and Korea right now. So thanks for tuning in, and listen in again next time.
Thank you.